Hi everyone, I'm Dr.Animaction. Welcome to the 6th episode of the US version of my ongoing animation retrospective, The Animated 80s. One quick correction for last year before we start, as it was pointed out to me that the Bugs Bunny Looney Tunes Comedy Hour premiered in the upcoming 1985 rather than 84. Other than that though, we're still good and on track here, so I'm pretty happy about that. As usual, if you love all things 80s and animated, make sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already. Now on with the decade. We'll begin as always with a quick recap of 1984, which took everything awesome about 83, continued most of the best series, built on its progress, and added several more pieces of greatness to it. I'll give a special mention to the heavy hitters of that year as it birthed a couple of definite classics with Transformers, Voltron, and Muppet Babies. It saw us looking to other sources besides Japan for outside influence with the introduction of the UK's Danger Mouse series, and it saw the first hints of the boy-girl divide that would become more prominent over the rest of the decade and into the next. So all in all, more good than bad in 84. But how will 1985 stack up? Let's take a look. What did we still have hanging on in 1985 from previous years? A decent amount, actually. Fat Albert was still hanging on, making it the last survivor from 1980. 1981 also had just a single holdout with the Smurfs, and nothing from 1982 made it this far. However, several series from the 1983 lineup were still on the air, including Brain Games, which was really making the most out of its 6 episodes, The Charlie Brown and Snoopy Show, Dungeons & Dragons, which would get a final 6-episode season this year, He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, The Littles, Mr. T, Inspector Gadget, Donald Duck Presents, Good Morning Mickey, and Alvin and the Chipmunks. G.I. Joe would also be back this year with a full series instead of a 5-episode run like the previous years. And then 1984 carryovers included Challenge of the GoBots, Heathcliff, Kid Video, Lucky Luke, Rainbow Bright, Scary Scooby Funnies, Super Friends and the Legendary Superpowers Show, Voltron, Transformers, Snorks, Muppets, and Danger Mouse. That was quite a few of the series we got in 1984, but not all of them. So what did we lose? Unfortunately, a couple of greats, the most painful of which were Pole Position and the Mighty Orbots, which only got a single season each. In addition to those, though, we also lost Dragon's Lair, the new Scooby-Doo Mysteries, which was less unfortunate as it took Scrappy with it, Pink Panther and Sons, Turbo Teen, Wolf Rock TV, and the Get Along Gang. Star Blazers Season 3 also concluded that storyline and meant the end of the Star Blazers in America, and this year was one that marked an increase in what would come to be a painful scenario throughout the rest of the decade with the rise and fall of single-season shows. We'll be seeing plenty of those over the next 5 videos that died too soon. But we won't dwell on the negative, at least not yet. Instead, let's see what this new year introduced to us. We officially entered the second half of the decade, and it kicks off with a bang, bringing us 28 new series. This year we'd get a little bit of everything, with new versions of classic characters, adaptations of some big properties, the emergence of an essential piece of most 80s childhoods, more shows from other countries, and a deepening divide between the girls and boys. I want to start with a snowball that was thrown this year that became an avalanche over the next 30. Yes, the 80s was a long time ago. Thanks for making us all feel old. But the first series I'm going to talk about were also from a galaxy far, far away. 1985 saw our first 2 animated spin-offs of what would grow to become one of the most popular and influential pillars in all of pop culture, Star Wars. Well, first 2 animated spin-offs in a series form at least. We got the animated segment marking Boba Fett's first appearance in 1978 during the Christmas special, but we'll overlook that one. You know, like most Star Wars fans do. But this year we got both Star Wars Droids and the Ewoks animated series, demonstrating that kids really will watch anything that has Star Wars attached to it. Droids took 2 of the arguably most boring characters, well, one of the most boring characters, R2 was cool, and made them the central focus of their own series. George Lucas's first venture into the plush toy market also got their own series, likely piggybacking on the success of the made-for-TV Ewok movies from this and the previous year. This series took a more Smurfs-like approach, though, with the Ewoks living their daily lives and confronting an evil witch and a group of rivals. Both shows had their moments of fun, but they're most notable for demonstrating how easily the Star Wars universe could be viably expanded. Another series that I wanted to highlight from this year marked the expansion of another multimedia juggernaut, but one that was significantly different than Star Wars: wrestling. I'll admit that I don't really follow wrestling or consider myself a fan today, but in the 80s it was a different story. I know that modern wrestling has a ton of superstars and legions of fans, but even so, I just don't think it can compare to the phenomena that was Hulkamania. And it was this phenomenon that gave birth to Hulk Hogan's Rockin' Wrestling. This show gave us animated versions of all our favorite wrestlers, divided into Hulk's good guys and Rowdy Roddy Piper's bad guys, traveling around to events and getting up to various hijinks. It was really a pretty great show, and almost every kid I knew at the time loved wrestling, and even those big chunks of non-posable plastic we got as action figures. I even went to a live WWF, as it was still called back then, event in the late 80s with my oldest brother. It was a unique era for the sport, and a lot different than how it presents itself today. So we got a new batch of Japanese cartoons this year, and in my personal opinion, the best of the decade. Not only did we get Transor Z, which was an adaptation of one of Japan's preeminent giant robot series in Mazinger Z, but we also got Captain Harlock and the Queen of a Thousand Years, which took the merging of shows formula to a new level by not simply attaching two shows to each other, but interweaving them into a single storyline. The series took the Japanese cartoons Captain Harlock and Queen Millennia, which shared a creator and art style, and sliced them into a single 65-episode series. We also got another series from the UK in the form of the banana-themed superhero Banana Man, and our first Canadian production in the form of The Raccoons, which followed some anthropomorphic raccoons on their misadventures. Oh yeah, I almost forgot, we got another little show from Japan called Robotech, which I guess is technically 3 little shows: Super Dimension Fortress Macross, Super Dimension Cavalry Southern Cross, and Genesis Climber Mospeda. The 3 series were consolidated into a single story that spanned 3 generations of characters, told across 85 episodes in its 3 separate story arcs. This cartoon was probably hands down my personal favorite of the decade, even though I prefer some other properties more. It was filled with everything any good adult series needed, including action, drama, romance, intrigue, and war, and included violence and death on levels we'd never seen before in US animation. Combine that with the coolest technology designs of the decade, and what you end up with was pure solid animation gold. There'd be other animes brought to America over the rest of the decade, but none of them would achieve the majesty of Robotech. So one thing I've briefly touched on throughout this series, but haven't gone into any real detail about, is the angry parent uproar that was happening throughout the 80s. This was the decade that gave birth to MTV and Satanic Panic and Tipper Gore and
Won't somebody please think of the children?
And a lot of moms jumped straight onto that bandwagon. All of that magic and violence and magical violence that we got in the 80s was a huge source of concern for overly protective parents. Even in my house, my mom wouldn't let me watch He-Man.
Because He-Man are the devil.
She also wouldn't let me watch the Adam West Batman because it was too violent, but I could watch war movies and westerns with her and Dad all day. Not sure where the delineation was there, but I digress. Back to the protesting moms. This year saw a good amount of placating, sanitized entertainment too. CBS Story Break, the Berenstain Bears, the Wuzzles, and Care Bears, which I actually remember seeing in the theater, all came out this year. Each was more focused on enemies who fit more of a bully role than a villain role, and told stories where the heroes won through acts of kindness or by being patient and caring. They focused on telling stories with moral or ethical messages, unlike all the other 80s series, which focused on telling more moral or ethical stories, but with a darker coat of paint, I guess. As I mentioned before, we saw some classic characters come back to airways this year too. New versions of Yogi Bear, the Jetsons, Scooby-Doo, the DC Superheroes, and the Muppets all premiered this year. The Jetsons made their triumphant return to TV after more than 20 years and told all new stories with minimal changes to the recipe of the original series from 1962. Scooby-Doo again got 2 new shows this year, with one, Scooby's Mystery Funhouse, being another rerun compilation, and the other being new stories hosted by none other than horror legend himself, Vincent Price, in the 13 Ghosts of Scooby-Doo. The DC Universe continued its series run with Super Friends, the legendary Superpowers show, ending in August of this year and being replaced in September with the Superpowers team, Galactic Guardians, which told more dramatic stories than those found in older iterations of the Super Friends. Quick note about this series for Star Trek fans: Deep Space Nine's Odo, Rene Auberjonois, was the voice of Darkseid's right-hand man, Desaad. The Muppets already had a successful cartoon on the air with Muppet Babies, but added a second with the premiere of Little Muppet Monsters. And lastly, Yoga Bear was back and ran as part of the Funtastic World of Hanna-Barbera, which was a 90-minute programming block that included a couple of other shows we'll talk about later. I know I said these mostly went away, and they did in that double bill or multi-bill format. What we started seeing instead this year were programming blocks, and eventually we'd see those evolve into blocks that were network-based rather than production-based. It's kind of a progression throughout the 80s and 90s. I'll also use this section to mention an adaptation of a live-action show from the time with It's Punky Brewster, which was an animated version of the sitcom voiced by the original actors where the title character meets and has wacky adventures with a magical woodchuck or something. It's a weird take on the material. And speaking of programming blocks, I guess this is as good a place as any to talk about them. This year, we got the aforementioned Fantastic World of Hanna-Barbera, as well as another block that was called a block, but really featured bite-sized show segments as a 30-minute show. The Fantastic World not only contained Yogi's Treasure Hunt, but also a new Smurfs-type series called Paw Paws, and an action-adventure sword and sorcery show called Galtar and the Golden Lance. There's not a lot to say about Paw Paws, since they were pretty formulaic in that Hanna-Barbera sense. It's almost exactly Smurfs or Snorks, but with magic bears. Galtar is one that I personally didn't remember, so I recently bought and started watching it, and it's cool enough. It's medieval defend the kingdom from evil wizard fare through and through, and uses the magic weapon trope, but it's a pretty cool weapon that could take various forms and had a worthiness clause like Thor's hammer, so that was neat. The second block-type program I mentioned was called Super Sunday, or potentially Super Saturday, depending on the market. During its 1985 airings, it included the shows Robotics, Bigfoot and the Muscle Machines, and Gem, before the latter became its own standalone series. Robotics was based on a system of building toys that looked kind of like the love child of erector sets and Legos. They were unique amongst their building toy contemporaries, though, as each set contained powered motors and a control console to give the sets various action and play features. The series, on the other hand, told the story of a race of aliens who survived the destruction of their planet by uploading their minds into giant robots, but the conflict between the two warring sides of the planet continued on a new planet, where the robots found humanoid pilots to combine their powers with. Bigfoot and the Muscle Machines was an attempt to capitalize on the fact that monster trucks were almost as popular as wrestling during this period, and Gem was about a music group. Gem gets a full series in 1986, so we'll talk about it more there. The last thing I want to mention about programming blocks isn't regarding one that came from 1985, but rather one that would build on the foundation of a series that came in 1985. I mentioned the Wuzzles a little earlier, but Disney had a second, far more significant release this year. A release that bounced here and there and everywhere. The Adventures of the Gummy Bears was another Smurf-type show that followed the adventures of a group of anthropomorphic bears in a medieval fantasy world, fighting monsters and protecting the innocent with the use of their magical gummy berry juice. However, it's not the series itself or the concept that I find most important here. Rather, it's the fact that this series would become the first show in the eventual Disney afternoon programming block, which would be my personal after-school go-to for years. I can only imagine it was the same for most of my similarly aged contemporaries, as over its tenure the block contained so many great shows it could be its own video. And maybe it will be. We'll see. We'll finish this video in the place my personal bias always ends up taking us, though. Action. What a great year this would be for it, too. Not only did G.I. Joe become a full series this year, but we saw a couple of other classics emerge, too, with 5 stellar cartoons hitting our TVs. 1985 gave us massive franchises like Thundercats and Mask, an expansion to an existing franchise with She-Ra, Princess of Power, a series that barely lined up with its toy line in Jace and the Wheeled Warriors, and the tragically short-lived experiment that was Sectaurs. These were all some hefty doses of awesomeness, and so iconic that I don't even know what to say about most of them. If you're watching this channel, though, chances are I don't need to say anything at all. Thundercats was a great series with amazing characters and animation that remains a part of pop culture to this day, even getting a reboot within the last decade. Mask gave us some great characters, some great technology, and some unparalleled toys. The Transformers may have done the robots in disguise thing, but normal vehicles that became combat vehicles and were driven by secret agents with superpowered masks were something else entirely. This is a series that should have lasted longer and should come back today. I know it's part of the Hasbro shared universe, but I mean as an independent, standalone show. She-Ra took everything great about He-Man, mostly, and made it a more accessible show for girls. They may have toned down some of the fighting, and the supporting cast may not have been as visually distinct as the Masters were, but it was still a pretty great show. Jace and the Wheeled Warriors gave us another take on the transforming vehicles concept, but did it with fully interchangeable parts. The series was a great space opera adventure, though, with the characters never actually appearing in plastic. And finally, Sectaurs was a miniseries of 5 episodes made in parallel to a toy line and comic book centered on a race of humanoid people who take on insect-like characteristics after a planetary evolution from a genetic experiment run wild. These people came from one of 2 warring states, the Shining Realm and the Dark Domain, and combat each other atop giant insects with whom they form symbiotic relationships. Each of these is a classic piece of 1980s animated action. Alright, so here's your guide on where to officially watch these shows as of June 2023. Unfortunately, there's a pretty full list of shows that have no official release from this year, including Captain Harlock and the Queen of a Thousand Years, Transor Z, Little Muppet Monsters, Sectaurs, The Wuzzles, Hulk Hogan's Rockin' Wrestling, It's Punky Brewster, Bigfoot and the Muscle Machines, CBS Story Break, Banana Man, and the Raccoons. Robotics was previously released in a collected movie edition, but it's out of print. There are usually a couple of used Region 2 copies available on the secondary market, though. In slightly better news, the original Captain Harlock and Mazinger Z series are both available on Amazon if you're good watching the subbed versions, and the original Queen Millennia can be picked up at a reasonable price used. A couple of the others on this list can probably be found on YouTube. Hint, hint. A few series are easily available for streaming, including Star Wars Droids and Ewoks, both on Disney+. The Superpowers team, Galactic Guardians, can be purchased on Prime Video, and Yogi's Treasure Hunt and Scooby-Doo's Mystery Funhouse can be watched with a Boomerang sub. Everything else, including the 13 Ghosts of Scooby-Doo, Care Bears, Jason the Wheeled Warriors, all 3 arcs of Robotech, The Jetsons, Mask, Gem, The Berenstain Bears, She-Ra, Princess of Power, Adventures of the Gummy Bears, The Paw Paws, Galtar and the Golden Lance, and the Thundercats are all currently available on DVD. I'm sad to say that we can't count on any of these staying available, as I've picked up a number of series over the past decade that I've found doing these videos are now all out of print and going for upwards of $100. I have some pretty severe FOMO, so I don't let them pass me up when I find them anymore. Also, one last note, the US version of Mask only contains the first 65 episodes, so it's missing the 10-episode second season of Mask Racers. If you have a region-free disc player, I've also linked a PAL set that costs way less and includes all 75 episodes. Just wanted to give you all a heads up. And that's it. Everything that premiered for us here in the US in 1985. I know these videos keep getting a bit longer all the time, but hey, we keep getting more cartoons. Plus, if I'm allowed to be a little prideful, I think I'm getting better at making them. I hope you all feel the same and that you're continuing to enjoy the series. Let me know your thoughts on the video, the year, the current state of world socio-political affairs, whatever you want to chat about in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe and watch for another video soon. Thanks everyone for watching. Stay tuned and stay tuned, as in cartoons. Later.